So anyways, like I was saying last week, the Church of Jesus is actually meant to invade the territory of evil, go on the offensive. That's what Jesus wants. But I think a lot of people in here have slept since last week. So let's recap. Last week we started looking at Matthew 16, starting in verse 13, and we went through verse 20, and we're going to start in 21 and go through 28 today. But starting in verse 13, we saw that Jesus initiates this conversation with his disciples about who do the crowds say that I am. And then he turns that conversation and reinitiates it into the conversation. Okay, who do you say that I am? What about you 12 guys? And I'm sure it got very quiet at that point until finally Simon Peter speaks up to answer the question. I believe you're the Messiah. I believe you're much more than a prophet that the crowds think of you as. And in return for his faith, Jesus then initiates giving Simon the name Peter, meaning rock. It's a Greek play on words for you're a foundation stone on which I'm going to build more, something called a church. So this new community of Jesus the Messiah is beginning with Peter in this moment, and it would be built upon to include, right down to today, everybody here who also has faith in Jesus as the Messiah. But Jesus also initiated investing his community with his own messianic authority, which is what he says to Peter. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind is bound. Whatever you loosed is loosed. This is authority that's designed to be shared by everybody, because only a few chapters later, he says the same phrase, binding and loosing, to all the disciples. It's repeating Old Testament themes. New names, investment of power go right back to creation, where God invests in humanity. Adam and Eve are invested with humanity. They have to share that authority when they start having kids. But it's also about starting over with a new community, the same way that God renames Abram to Abraham, and Jacob, meaning heel grabber, to Israel, meaning he who wrestles with God. So Jesus is starting over with a new humanity one last time, but he's investing this new humanity of his with the power over evil, the power ultimately to conquer evil, the power where churches and decisions that we make as Christians are going to have real, true, long-lasting consequences that heaven itself will reward or punish based on. All of this is taking place in a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's a place just south of the Mount Hermon mountain regions. Hopefully by now you've Googled the pictures and seen the big rock formation there, and why Jesus is referring to a rock here, because it's like right in front of him. And the play on words works because Caesarea Philippi was considered, hey, these are the gates of hell. This is where hell on earth actually exists. And we're going to storm these gates, and I'm going to build a new community, and this new community is going to vanquish these hellish powers on earth in time. So Jesus, like a lot of prophets, is telecasting his ideas geographically. Where he's at matters to the story. So Jesus wants his church to do what he himself is doing. He's going up to the gates of hell. He's declaring his intention to start a fight with these powers, conquer them, and he's going to build a church that's ultimately going to carry on that fight. So what Jesus wants is for his church to follow him in going on the offensive in the war against intelligent evil powers. This is what we just kind of summarize with all the time by calling spiritual warfare. It's much more involved than that, but that's enough to be getting along with in this passage. So today I want to pose a question in light of last week. If Jesus wants us to go on the offensive against intelligent evil powers, how do we go on the offensive? How do we do that? What does an offensive battle look like? An offensive battle against evil means that, like Jesus, we have to learn to live sacrificially. We have to learn to give up our own lives, our own desires, and our own wills for the good of others. To say it another way, if you're accepting Jesus' power and his authority, it is the power to initiate sacrificial living. sacrificing things for the good of others. If I had to summarize it and just give you, since we're talking about what we consider spiritual warfare here, rightly so, but in warfare, you have offense and you have defense. If I could summarize it moving forward, your offensive fight is primarily, though not solely, that you have to speak up the truth against evil. In a world of lies, you're going to have to be brave and courageous and good enough to speak the truth. Defensively, you're going to have to actually let unjust suffering happen to you. You're just going to have to be attacked. You're just going to have to be hurt. You're going to tell somebody the truth, they're going to hate you for it, they're going to smack you in the face, and you're just going to have to let it happen without verbally or physically turning and attacking them back. So you've got an offensive element, you've got a defensive element, but primarily doing both of these things is the offensive fight that overthrows evil power in this world. So let's read the passage again, starting in verse 13, all the way down through verse 28, and then we'll focus starting in verse 21. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" He asked, "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter," meaning rock, "and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or hell, will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? But the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man come into his kingdom." Verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples what we now just kind of summarize as the Passion. And this is the first time that Jesus just drops metaphors, euphemisms, any parabolic speaking that he does to the public, and in private, he just point blank tells the 12, this is exactly what is going to happen. The idea that connects it back to the previous verses is this. To paraphrase, now that you have correctly understood who I am as the Messiah, let me help you understand what that means. To be the Messiah is to march down to Jerusalem and die at the hands of wicked people. That's how I'm going to become King of heaven and earth. That's what's going to happen in this fight against intelligent evil. They're going to have a victory, or it's going to look like a victory, and God's going to flip the whole thing upside down and break their control in this world. So let's get something straight about this idea of initiating a fight against intelligent evil. Because I didn't say it last week, and I think it needs to be said, the true enemies of God, that you could say is the true enemy of the church, are never physical people, ever. They are always non-physical. You call them demons. They go by a lot of names in the Bible, but just to think of demonic, satanic powers in general, these are not people. Humans can ally themselves with these non-physical evil beings, these demonic forces, but they're never the true enemy. Because of this, physical violence and physical attacks cannot be the path to defeating these enemies. Armed resistance and revolution cannot bring God's kingdom on earth. That is a fundamental thing that we just need to make clear. Not even the Messiah himself in this moment can summon an army and defeat these beings. And if he doesn't, they still hold power. So physical violence cannot establish the kingdom of God, but these intelligent evil powers still have to be confronted. And the war still has to be won. That question is how? How do you confront evil if you can't swing a sword at it? If you can't pull out a gat and bust a cap at it? No, I heard a guy say that once. If you can't shoot it, and believe me, I'm Texan, we like our guns. If you can't pull out your gun and shoot evil and defeat it, how do you go about fighting it? I like how the NIV says Jesus must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things. The translation is trying to draw out this explicit need for these things absolutely have to happen. But of course, nobody had ever conceived of the Messiah having that happen to them. For them, the Messiah, the primary idea of the Jews of Jesus' day is that the Messiah is conceived as a military figure who crushes his enemies with pure force. He's like Caesar, but better than Caesar. Well, if he's going to just march on your territory with an army, he's no better than Caesar. So the Messiah is not going to do that. I'm pointing this out because Peter's understanding and response in verse 22 is perfectly understandable. This would have been the most natural thing in the world, and Peter, being the brave man that he is just naturally going to speak up. Peter takes him aside, begins to rebuke him. Never, Lord, this will never happen to you. I had never really looked at this verse in Greek before, so it was very interesting what gets lost in translation, this idea that Peter's actually declaring to Jesus that he's going to protect Jesus from facing these things. I declare to you, Jesus, that as my Messiah, I'm not going to let these bad things happen to you. Peter is actually saying that. When he says, this shall never happen to you in the NIV, it means I'm not going to let this happen to you. I'll protect you. Peter's misunderstanding of this need for the Messiah to suffer leads him to declare, with the best of intentions, that he's going to protect Jesus from such things. So Peter's belief is that the Messiah should not, indeed must not, be allowed to suffer these things, which is why Jesus has to be so harsh in his response to Peter. Did you catch that? Did you listen to it while I was reading the tone of the passage? Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan!" And it's not exactly a nice, polite moment. It's a very tense moment. You're just a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the things of God, just the things of mere people, humans. Satan? Stumbling block? 5 verses ago, whatever it was, Jesus was telling Peter that he's a blessed rock on which he can build a whole community. Why is Jesus being so intense here? Why is he rebuking Peter for trying to rebuke him? Because he has to be, to correct Peter. And this is a good point to bring up the fact that Jesus had no problem with strong language. He had no problem calling things out, as any good prophet does. And of course, Jesus, being much more than a prophet, goes in ways and levels that even the prophets of old did not. If you look at the previous chapter before this, Matthew 15, about 20 verses there, Jesus spends just calling the Pharisees, you guys are hypocrites, you guys are wrong. He's doing all of this publicly, and then the disciples get him alone and they say, do you realize how offended the Pharisees were by what you said? So Jesus didn't have a problem saying things that offended people. Do we have a perspective of Jesus in our minds that he's so non-confrontational that he won't call out problems publicly with harsh language? Matthew 23, if you move forward, and I'm limiting myself to Matthew here because that's the book we're in, Jesus' last public temple teaching during the Passion Week is 7 prophetic woes to these scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders. You guys are so hypocritical that you care what everybody thinks about you except for God. And then he turns around and he walks out of the temple and he doesn't go back. That's it. That's the end of his public ministry. 7 woes against the Pharisees. And these are like the highest level of prophetic rebuke that you can do publicly. and Jesus did 7 of them. How do we square the circle of Jesus not being polite in his language and attitude to these people while still being the embodiment of love? Could it be that we've misunderstood what it means to be kind, to be polite in public settings? If he confronted them on their hypocrisy, they at least stand a chance of repenting of it. That's part of it. Anyone who's unwilling to confront evil head-on isn't tough enough to be as good as our God and our King. We're talking about mothers here today because it's Mother's Day. Even mothers have to be tough enough to tell their kids no, to tell their kids you did wrong, to tell their kids that's absolutely the wrong behavior, to punish them for it and help them learn the lesson so that they don't repeat that behavior. But sometimes we go too far and we assume that impolite and confrontational language is somehow unloving, when the example of Jesus is often the exact opposite. If, in our fears of being perceived as either confrontational or unloving, we do not confront what needs to be confronted, we're just giving evil what it wants. Silence. Silence from people who know God's truth, who need to actually go on the offensive and vocalize it in a world full of lies. The thing about loving speech that most people talk about, that I hear today in our overly humanistic world that doesn't view the world as God in charge of it, it doesn't matter what these people say, because there's never going to be speech that's loving enough for people to actually confront the reality that God is in charge, not them. Real intelligent evil enemies of God do try to emotionally blackmail us as Christians into backing down from the fight in speaking the truth. And they will say, well, you're not speaking in love. Maybe you don't perceive it, but honestly, is there any good way that I could say this where you would listen to it? If there is, I'll struggle to find it. But the fact of the matter is, you don't want to hear it, and it needs to be said. So I'm just going to accept the fact that you don't want to hear it, and I'm going to tell you anyways. You can view that as rude and as unloving as possible. You can call me cruel. You can call me mean for speaking up. I'll take those hits. But somebody has to tell you that this is not right, because there are consequences to these actions, to these ideas in our culture. See, we don't need Ned Flanders Christians. Okay, if you've ever watched The Simpsons, Ned Flanders is Homer Simpson's overly Christian, polite neighbor, and Homer, of course, just walks all over him in every way, shape, and form. Nothing about this loving others and sacrificing for others is ever meant to make us a doormat so that other people can abuse and use us. Polite, non-confrontational attitudes at all cost. That's not a very Jesus-like attitude. Not when you really see the people who need to hear it most are right in front of you. You've got to speak up and say it. You may not need to go looking for a fight, but when you see the fight around you, you need to be strong and good enough, brave enough to speak up and engage it on some level. We need to be convicted and convinced enough of God's truth that you're strong enough to stand up for it. You're tough, and you're, when you have to be, confrontational enough, even intense moments of heated emotion. As I'm sure this moment is between Jesus and Peter. We just had a great moment 5 minutes ago. Jesus, why are you so upset all of a sudden? Jesus is kind of leaning into this tension emotionally. Jesus, I think, was the perfect model of this truth. You have to be tough to be good. Ned Flanders, not tough. Of course, he's a satirical look at Christianity, so nobody's calling on you to be like him. But if we can't tell the difference between the Simpsons humor and the word of the Lord, we'll kind of just default to, as long as I'm not rude or polite, I'm a good Christian. There's so much more involved than that. The only reason I think that, evil won't come after you, won't make you suffer for your faith in Jesus, is that on some level, you're not actually tough enough to go up against them, and so they just leave you alone. If you're tough enough to stand up to evil, evil's going to fight back, obviously. So you have to be tough to be good. Simon Peter, the blessed rock, who's the first person to openly declare his faith in Jesus as the Messiah, still completely misunderstands what it actually means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And Jesus is trying to tell him, trying to correct him. Don't get in my way, Peter, or you're no better than Satan, who's already tried to stop me from this. If you look back in Matthew 4, especially verses about 8 through 11, Jesus' temptations, the devil's already offered to make Jesus king of the whole world if he just bows down to him. Thankfully, Jesus didn't do that. The devil has no idea that the Messiah has to go through crucifixion to do that. But Jesus does, and Jesus understands if I do this, I can circumvent the cross. But thankfully, he doesn't take that deal, that fool's bet, and he proceeds to the cross because it's necessary for the Messianic king to actually be the one to suffer and die. And Peter, at this point, he just fails to understand. It is necessary for the Messiah to go through the cross so that he can enter his glory. Because he doesn't understand that it's necessary, he is accidentally a stumbling block to Jesus. Something in the way of Jesus doing what has to be done in the fight against evil. And often people who are trying to be so polite and non-confrontational also end up in their own ways today, being stumbling blocks, keeping the tension out of it when you need the tension to actually wage the war on some level. So that people can hear it and follow the truth. And yeah, Jesus is verbally harsh on the guy here. He has to be. So what does it mean to be the Messiah in verses 21 through 23? To be the Messiah, to have messianic power and messianic authority, is actually to lovingly engage in self-sacrifice for the good of others. It means I have to, Jesus is saying, reject comfort and embrace adversity in the fight against evil. Even unjust suffering, I have to embrace it. Now, Jesus is not some masochist seeking pain and suffering, but he knows he can't run from it, and he's tough enough to face it. Evil is going to seek to destroy him because he's actually good. So counterintuitively, he says, fine, I'll just embrace everything evil can throw at me without throwing evil back, and I'll let evil overplay its hand, and God can make resurrection happen out of that. And then there's nothing that they can do about it. Once he's raised from the dead, they can't kill him again. So he has to get to that point. But see, it's the point of where we're heading in these verses is that it's not merely true for the Messiah alone, that he has to face these things and suffer unjustly. The community that he's building on Peter, who's remaining the blessed building stone here, in spite of an honest stumbling stone moment with Jesus, is that the community itself is going to have to face the adversity and suffer unjustly. Jesus rebukes Peter and works to clarify it's not only necessary for myself to suffer according to God's intentions, it's necessary for anyone who wants to follow God, follow me through this, that they're also going to have to suffer as they go on the offense against evil. That alone is the true path of fighting evil in this world, which is why Paul can say things in 2 Timothy 3:12. You know, anybody who seeks to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. He can say that because he understands the fight. He's been living it long enough at that point that he can speak of it in such hyperbolic terms. Anyone who's seeking to live faithfully for the Lord in a world that's turned against him is going to suffer for it. So, verse 24, Jesus turns to the whole 12, and by extension is telling us as a church this bold statement. I'm not going to be the only one. You're going to have to take up a cross and die yourself. The cross is an instrument of slow, painful, humiliating death. It is not an efficient way to kill people. It wasn't supposed to be. Anyone seeking to wield this invested power of Jesus the Messiah that is initially offered to Peter and extends out to all of us, you're wielding the power to give up your own will. Not come to me or Terry and start making demands. Hey, do this or do that. Are you tough enough to pursue the Lord in light of the consequences that you know are going to come? Just this week, a UK pastor named Clive Johnston was fined $600 by Judge Peter King because he was preaching John 3:16 in a safe access zone, which meant he was too close to an abortion clinic. So he was charged $600 as a fine for what he did back in 2024 this week. If $600 is all that it actually costs to preach the gospel in a hell-infested place like an abortion clinic, I say just pay the money. Let them fine you. Let them take your cash. Who cares? It is better that happens and that the lives of women and their babies can be saved. So just pay the cost. It's nothing to the cost of these poor mothers if they don't repent of murdering God's most innocent and defenseless image bearers. So if $600 is all it costs, just pay the money. Just pay the fine. That's a valid form of civil disobedience. You're still keeping the law. You're still fulfilling the unjust human law. You're just doing it differently. Just pay the money. But I use that example because the church exists for moments like this. One, somebody has to stand up and tell the truth in a world that doesn't want to hear it. And two, the community can actually bear the cost together. It doesn't have to be one person, for instance, Pastor Clive Johnston, bearing the cost alone. So Jesus' call to freely take up evil's weapon, just let him do evil to you, is the call to wield the power of self-sacrifice against intelligent evil. I want you to willingly initiate something this week, and you can decide what it is. What's the thing that you've been putting off sacrificing your time, your energy, and your effort to do that would be good and beneficial for somebody else? Do that this week. Get it done. And you know, if you will voluntarily choose to step up and do it, if you will take up this cross or a burden sacrificially, this language of take up, if you will do the thing voluntarily, you're infinitely more likely to master it than if somebody has to nag you into doing it or push you into doing it. If you will just volunteer yourself to do it, you're going to master it at some point. And you're going to realize whatever you're so intent on not doing is probably not that big a deal anyways. And you can move on from there to bigger sacrifices and bigger things. Think of the mythical figure of a phoenix. A phoenix is a creature that lives its life, bursts into flames to die, and is reborn from the ashes. Now, I realize that some movies like Harry Potter sometimes make the phoenix bursting into flames seem like it's not that big a deal. But I gotta say, in ancient stories, a phoenix bursting into flames is still bursting into flames. It still has to catch fire to die, to be reborn. But see, it's a symbol for life, death, and rebirth. And you're going to have to choose the pain of bursting into flames, dealing with yourself the way that you are and what's stopping you. And it's going to hurt, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to have to accept that, burst into flames, deal with it, so that you can be reborn out of the ashes as a stronger, more faithful person. Are you willing to actively take up the cross and suffer in the fight against evil? Are you going to risk being misunderstood by that evil and confronting it anyways? What happens if I do? You'll suffer. What happens if you don't? You'll suffer more in the end. Verse 25. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it, because God's kingdom brings reversal. You know, delaying gratification is a sign of maturity. The person who is not immediately looking to have what they want right now is a more mature person than a person who's just said, I'm hungry, give me food, give it to me now. And the person who can do hard things and delay the reward for it until later is a more mature person than somebody who's like, well, I did it, I expect some reward here, give me words of affirmation, give me a paycheck, give me something. So voluntarily submitting to pain and suffering now will lead to unending glory to come. But if somebody wants to get out of the pain and suffer, won't volunteer for it, you're just going to lose everything anyways. So verse 26 says, what offers this thing I call the fool's bet? What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? It's an invitation to think about God's kingdom reversal circumstances. The things God is doing, He's using suffering and making us capable of engaging with Him through our suffering. Suffering will come to an end, but Jesus is saying God's glorious reward will never come to an end. So take the long-term bet. Put your money in the stock markets now and just let it ride for 30 years, right? Don't just play the stocks up and down every day. Take the long-term bet, and when you're in 30 years, you'll have more money invested if you don't touch it. That's an example of what Jesus is calling us to. Take the long-term bet. Evil will have its short-term victories. Evil may strike you, but in the end, you can defeat evil in this world. You can take their power away, but you have to embrace pain and suffering. If you accept short-term comfort that is immediately available, you will forfeit a true life of value, a true life of purpose. Just because that purpose comes with suffering, with a little bit of pain that's going to come to an end. Jesus' whole conflict with the religious leaders is that they've accepted the fool's bet. They want their short-term comfort and they want men to glorify them, but ultimately they're going to lose it all. Jesus isn't doing that. Jesus is saying, I'll march on the gates of hell here in Caesarea Philippi. I'll reveal myself to them in this transfiguration, and then I'll march straight down to Jerusalem and I'll let them kill me. Because that's what it's going to take. So I'll accept that short-term suffering so that I can give you long-term glory. So that even He can enter His long-term glory that way. Verse 27a, for the Son of Man is going to come in His Father's glory with His angels. I think this probably should be translated into English something more like, the Son of Man is going to come into His Father's glory. Then He'll reward everyone. The point is that the crucifixion that Peter is trying to stop here is the path that Jesus Himself has to take so that He can be granted the messianic power by God to set the world to right. Even the Son of Man, this glorious Daniel 7 figure, isn't just walking into heaven and getting everything. He comes from earth after He goes through suffering. If that's what it's going to be for Jesus, do we really think it's going to be any different for us? If Jesus got to glory by going through pain and suffering, how do you honestly think we're going to have to get there ourselves? Because 27b says, He will reward each according to what they've done. So He's saying, when I face the cross, when I've overcome evil and death, I'll not only invest my community with power, I'll also have the power to distribute justice to everyone according to their deeds. Those who partnered with intelligent evil without repenting, they will be condemned. Those who sought comfort in this age and didn't want to get involved with the fight, they'll be on the side of those that actively participated with evil. But those who gave up their comfort and fought against evil and suffered the consequences were initiating their own sacrifice, as I did, and those people will be rewarded beyond measure forever. If we make the fool's bet, Jesus has the cosmic consequences to enforce the consequences of our choices. Because He faced this cosmic evil, and He fought it head on, and He overcame their weapon of death. But first He had to die, and so will we. That's why He can speak with such assurance in verse 28. I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they've seen the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. This is not a statement about the second coming, as it is just usually assumed. This is a verse about the certainty that Jesus is going to overcome evil and death in the lifetime of the apostles. Coming in His kingdom is not a literal statement about His return. It's a common way of describing His victory and His taking the throne. Because when a person fights and wins a war, the language was that person comes into His kingdom. He enters into the battle, wins, and is victorious. That's what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying something like, I'll be victorious precisely because of the cross, and when I am, you will see it, you will experience it, and then you will finally start to understand this stuff I'm telling you today. That in God's plan, my crucifixion is necessary, as is your own self-sacrifice in some way. We need to have such confidence and such conviction in His victory already over these evil powers that we will go on carrying the fight. The question is, are you willing to do it? Are you willing to do tough things? You can start small. I know a lot of people in the modern age, they just don't like praying in front of people. Well, guess what you're actually going to have to do to grow? What is the thing that you've been putting off doing? That's the thing you most need to do to grow. And stop delaying it, stop avoiding it, and saying, someday I'm going to get there. Make this day one, and get yourself there by starting. It could be something as so simple as, I never read my Bible. I don't even know where it is. Okay, step 1, find your Bible. Step 2, pick a reading plan and just stick with it and start getting the Word of God in your mind and in your heart. Start ingesting it in whatever way you can, and over time you refine the process. I find that so many people are just so unwilling to actually put any mental effort into being a follower of the Lord. And my question is, what is lazy thinking going to lead to? Lazy actions. If you're not even willing to do the simple thing of just spending time with God in Bible intake and prayer, when you're actually confronted by an intelligent evil power, or their human representatives are out there telling you you're cruel, you're mean, you're rude, back down, back down, back down, you're going to back down because you don't even have the toughness in your own private life where you have the most control to do something with God. So when it comes to the real fight, you're not going to engage in it. And I think that's where we're at in Western Christianity. We don't want to do the work of difficult things. We don't want to put in any effort into our Christianity, even just mentally. We don't want to sacrifice our time, our effort, to anything more than I expect a brief encouragement on Sunday mornings and then walk away and leave me alone. We're defaulting, I think, to a natural state of comfort, trying to avoid conflict. I understand it. It is our natural tendency. So we have to be more intentional about this, making ourselves uncomfortable so we can grow. So what's it going to be, church? What's it going to be for you personally? What's it going to be for Linden as a whole, publicly? Are you personally willing to do hard things in the fight against evil? How do we as a church engage in the warfare against God's evil enemies? We have to initiate our own self-sacrifice. Are we doing that? Are you personally willing to use His power to take up a cross and engage in your own self-sacrifice? Are you willing to sacrifice time? Are you willing to sacrifice energy in the effort to see other people receive good things from your work? Probably the most basic way is you just need to go on the offensive. You need to stand up to lies in the world, and you need to be willing to tell the truth. Do you know what God's truth is? Are you willing to say it out loud to people even if they hate you? Or are you going to risk being unloving in their eyes? That's a choice that we're left with here. Decide.